Welcome to Part 4 of Indians, Jacks, and Pines, which was written by Stuart D. Gross and published by him in 1962, a basic history of Saginaw, Michigan. We're on Chapter 11, City of the Swamp. For more than a decade following the Panic of 1838, the Saginaw region was almost at a standstill. Then, in 1849, Norman Little returned, this time with financial backing from Hoyt and Company of New York. With him came Jesse and Alfred Hoyt, brothers and sons of James Hoyt of the Hoyt Company. At first, Little tried to buy land in Saginaw City for a new development, but the price was way too high. So he turned his attention across the river, and the city that had no reason to be built materialized. The east bank of the Saginaw River was the most unlikely spot for a city that Michigan could possibly offer. It was low, while Saginaw City was high. It was foul, swampy land. Louis Campeau tried to set up a trading post on the east side of the river in 1820, but abandoned it when the Indians refused to trade there. They instead, insisted he confine his work to one location, the site of the 1819 signing of the Treaty of Saginaw. Harvey Williams had purchased some land south of the present Bristol Bridge in 1836 and built a sawmill. Williams also had plans for a city and in 1837 published a plat of the city of Saginaw. This plat ran a mile along the Saginaw River from a point about at the northern edge of the present Hoyt Park and extending back from the river 3/4 of a mile. The Depression of 1838 killed this idea too. In 1847, Curtis Emerson, who was to become one of the most eccentric of Saginaw lumber barons, purchased the old Williams sawmill on the east bank and in partnership with Charles W. Grant began the production of lumber. That same year, Emerson sent to C.P. Williams and Company, Albany, New York, the first full shipload of clear pine ever shipped from Michigan. A settlement sprang up around the mill, and Emerson named it Buena Vista. The town was organized in April 1849, and Emerson was elected its supervisor. Little purchased 2,400 acres of land, which covered what now is the East Side Business District. The property did not go as far south as Emerson's sawmill settlement of Buena Vista. Little's acres were largely swamp, which was in turn part of a massive swamp that began in what is now South Saginaw and extended the entire distance through what is now the East Side Business District. Today's Hoyt Park Bowl was part of this swamp. Apparently, overcoming the obstacles nature threw in his path only made Little more determined. He realized that if he was to populate his new city, he had to have a road through the forest for settlers to travel. There was a road of sorts connecting Saginaw to Flint. The military road to Flint had been cut through the forest in 1822, but it wasn't passable for wagons until around 1836. Little wanted a good road, and in those days a good road was a plank road. Besides, the road available crossed the Cass River at Bridgeport by scow, then followed roughly present-day South Washington Road to the foot of Mackinac Street, where a ferry boat took travelers across the Saginaw River to the city of Saginaw. Little applied to the state legislature in 1848 for a charter to build a new road of wooden planks from Saginaw to Flint, a distance of 32 miles. The legislators were shocked. Build a plank road to Flint through the wilderness? Nonsense, they snorted. Might as well build a road to the moon. But Little didn't give up so easily. He got the charter, and the Genesee Plank Road was started in 1850, and a sawmill was built to saw the planks for it. While waiting for the road, Little went ahead with plans for the city. He kept surveyors busy, and in 1850 announced the first mapping of East Saginaw. His map was known as Hoyt's Plat and included the area bounded on the north by Astor Street, on the east by 2nd Avenue, on the south by Emerson Street, and on the west by the river. Because of the plank road and because there was no river for settlers to cross, East Saginaw grew faster than Saginaw City. The forest surrounding the clearing at the heart of the city was cut away, and the acres were cleared and filled in with at least partially, and they were subdivided into lots. It was a strange-appearing town. Pine-board sidewalks were laid on pilings over the swamp water, and many of a store's back door opened onto water. More than one merchant could fish out of his back door of his store when business was slow. With the plank road, however, things began to happen. Stagecoaches came from Flint, and soon a post office was established, then a flour mill. Every day the people would look down the road for the first sight of the wagons bearing more settlers. And still they come was the cry of the day. It wasn't until 1852 that Little was confident of his new city was here to stay. East Saginaw was incorporated as a village in 1855, with Little as the first president. In 1857, Saginaw City was incorporated as a city with Gardner D. Williams as its first mayor. East Saginaw became a city 2 years later, in 1859. Somewhere in there, the little settlement of Buena Vista was absorbed by the growing East Side. Meanwhile, Little built a house on the northeast corner of Fitzhugh and Water Streets and settled back to watch his city grow. He didn't watch it long. On the morning of November 8, 1859, his body was found in the river that he loved so well, a victim of accidental drowning at the age of 54. Little brought the Hoyts to Saginaw, and their name is linked solidly with its history. Alfred was the first postmaster of East Saginaw, and in 1852 was elected state representative. In 1854, he sold his interest to his brother Jesse and returned to New York City. Jesse remained, and Hoyt Library and Hoyt Schools are named for him. East Saginaw prospered. It grew bigger and finer than Saginaw City, its older rival on the West Bank. East Saginaw was the first town in America to have streets paved with cedar blocks. It's supposed to be true that many a West Sider would fix up his fanciest rig on a summer evening, and with his span of horses prance proudly jog through the dust and ruts of his own city over to the east side, just to ride on the fancy cedar block pavement. East Saginaw also had the Swift Electric Light Company that was operating in 1881 and had electricity for street lighting. The light company was one of the show places of East Saginaw and fanned the rivalry between the two Saginaws. In 1884, Saginaw City had a proposal before the City Council to erect and operate an electric lighting plant. It was voted by Mayor Charles L. Benjamin, who later, the story goes, regarded that act as a blunder. While East Saginaw and Saginaw City were feuding and rivalry was bitter between the two cities, there were 3 other settlements now long gone that sprung up, flourished, and disappeared. Aaron Penny came out of New York State in 1848 and cleared a farm at what now is Center and South Washington and became the founder of a village. In 1853, William Gallagher, a land speculator, and his brother John purchased Penny's farmland and named it Salina. In 1866, Salina was incorporated as the village of South Saginaw and had a population of 3,000 persons. It was separated from East Saginaw by a bayou between what is now Hoyt Park and Weber Avenue. This barrier threatened to keep the two from joining, but in 1873, South Saginaw joined East Saginaw, casting its lot forever with the larger city. There was also the village of Florence. This place developed on the west side of the Saginaw River opposite the point Genesee Avenue meets the river. It consisted of 2 parallel streets and 39 lots and at one time boasted a sawmill, 3 salt blocks, 2 brine wells, and a shipyard. Strangely enough, the village of Florence existed on paper until 1940 when the C.K. Eddy and Sons asked the circuit court to vacate the old plat that had been originally filed July 28, 1857. There also was Melbourne. This place was on the west bank of the Saginaw River, 8 miles downstream from East Saginaw. It developed around a sawmill owned by Wellington R. Burt, perhaps the most famous of all of Saginaw's lumber barons, and definitely the richest. Melbourne started in 1864, and by 1870, the mill was among the largest and most complete in the world. It had 45 houses for families, 2 boarding houses, stores, library, and a school. It burned in 1876 and was never rebuilt. Meanwhile, leaders of East Saginaw and Saginaw City realized the rivalry between them could not be allowed to continue. Prosperity for both towns lay in the merger of the two. When consolidation first was proposed, it created such an argument that leaders felt it useless to let the people vote on the proposition. One of the bitterest of disputes was over the location of the city hall. Both sides wanted it, so a compromise was worked out. The city hall would be built on a site equally distanced from Saginaw Saginaw's west side, and east side business districts, and that is why the City Hall stands where it does today. Civic leaders of the two cities took their problems to the legislature and asked for a law to consolidate the two cities. This law was passed and became effective June 28, 1889. Then, in March 1890, the first election was held. The consolidation was approved, and George W. Weddock, a distinguished attorney and Democrat, was elected as the first mayor of the consolidated Saginaws. Chapter 12. Daylight in the Swamp. The Lumberjacks came west after logging off the New England states, and what they found on the Saginaw made their eyes pop. The forest was so thick they said it would take 100 years to cut. Greedily, they attacked the pine, and through the far reaches of the rivers that fed logs into the hungry mills at Saginaw, the Lumberjacks with their axes let daylight into the swamp. Lumbering in the Saginaw country was the biggest, the best, the rowdiest, and the Jacks boasted that they were the toughest. Saginaw was the lumbering capital of the world from 1851 until the pine gave out in the late 1890s, and the city wore its title with a jaunty air. They say Saginaw is built on 40 feet of sawdust, and maybe this is true, in spots anyways. It never has been measured so far as any living man knows, but there was enough pine lumber sawed in the mills here to make a pile 40 times 40 feet. From 1851, when lumbering became serious business, until 1897, the last big year, the Saginaw River floated pine logs that measured out to more than 25 billion feet of lumber, enough to build 1 million medium-sized homes. And just for good measure, Saginaw mills turned out more than 5 billion shingles, plus staves and hoops for barrels for shipment of salt that became a cousin of the lumber industry. A foot of lumber is a piece 12 inches square and 1 inch thick. It is the term of measurement used to tell how many feet of lumber there are in a log, and experienced lumbermen called scalers can figure this out to the inch. The first sawmill in Saginaw Valley was built in 1828 by Roland Perry and Harvey Spencer on Thread River at Grand Blanc near Flint. Another mill was built a year later on the Thread, but closer to Flint. The first steam sawmill on the Saginaw River was built for Gardner and Ephraim Williams in 1835 by their cousin Harvey Williams. It was a crude affair and could cut about 2,000 feet of 1-inch boards in a 12-hour day. The mill was located on the river just south of the present Mackinac Street. The second Saginaw mill was built in 1836 by Harvey Williams, but on the east side of the river just south of Bristol Bridge. This mill operated for 8 years and then was shut down. In 1846, it was purchased by Curtis Emerson and Charles W. Grant. These new owners put new boilers, a new engine, and other new equipment in it, and were ready to start making logging history. The mill was 55 feet long and 12 feet wide, and had a capacity of about 3 million feet of lumber a year. When Emerson sent the first cargo of lumber by boat out of Saginaw in 1847 to Albany, New York, its fine quality attracted attention. Almost immediately there was a demand for Saginaw pine. The next mill was built in 1850 by Charles W. Grant and Alfred Hoyt. By this time, Eastern capital had become excited about lumbering prospects on the Saginaw, and money poured in to build more mills. By the end of 1855, there were 23 mills producing 60 million feet of lumber per year. The growth continued in 1870. There were 83 mills on the Saginaw River yielding 576,736,000 feet of lumber. In the peak year of 1882, the cut was 1,011,274,905 feet. Saginaw came rightly by its position as lumber capital of the world. The Saginaw River, formed by Flint, Cache, Shiawassee, and Tittabawassee rivers, drains a total of 3,200 square miles from the Michigan Thumb area north and west into the Gladwin, Gratiot, Isabella, and Clare counties. These rivers and their tributaries all poured logs into Saginaw, but the Tittabawassee was the greatest of them all. This river and its tributaries flow through what was some of the finest pine country in Michigan and the finest in the nation. The Chippewa River, rising in Isabella County, and the Pine River, rising in Gratiot County, join the Tittabawassee River at Midland. The Salt River empties into it at Sanford, and the Tobacco River joins at Edenville, famous in Michigan lumbering history as Camp 16. The Cass River Valley became famous for its pure quality of pine. The river floated logs that cut into 1,126,000 feet of lumber. One of the Cass River's lumbering camps was located on land now occupied by the Tuscola County Courthouse in Cairo. As the logs floated into Saginaw on the various rivers, they had to be sorted as to ownership. Each log was marked, much as cattle are branded on the prairie range. The logs were collected in great booms, and from these booms, men would sort out all logs bearing the same log mark. These logs would be tied into rafts and floated down to the Saginaw River and thence to the Wright Mill. Each of the main rivers flowing into the Saginaw had what was called a boom company. The biggest of these was the Tittabawassee River Boom Company, which handled logs that cut into 11,850,000 feet of lumber in its lifetime. For many years, cutting of the timber was done only in the winter, and many farmers joined the Lumberjacks when they went north with the first snow to work until spring in the lumber camps. Winter was the season for work in the woods, for ice roads could be built for great sleds, hauling the logs from where they fell to the nearest stream, which would carry them down to Saginaw on the crest of the spring floods. Being a lumberjack was hard work and often boresome. The camps were far back in the woods, away from settlements, and the men very often would not come out of the woods until spring. For entertainment, they made up and sang ballads of their life and fellow workers. Often the rhymes were crude, but always they were sentimental and most often very sad. A few have been preserved, but many couldn't stand to live in print. Life for a lumberjack began early in the morning with a hearty breakfast, and the day was spent in the woods. Some crews would cut the trees, others would trim the branches off and pile them. These piles were called slashings, and they were left as worthless to dry out in the woods, and in time became the source of great fires that swept much of the state. Other crews would roll the logs onto sleds to be carted to the rollaways at riverbanks. The ox was the favorite animal of the logger. A team of horses might jerk or pull unevenly, but oxen gave a strong, steady pull that would not dislodge the logs piles on the sled, spill the logs, or block the road and perhaps injure the loaders. Accidents, of course, did happen, and hospital care was expensive. The nurses at St. Mary's Hospital in Saginaw saw the need for some kind of insurance, and through their ingenuity organized what may have been the first accident insurance of its kind in Michigan history. The nurses would go into the lumber camps and, for a modest price, sell the lumberjacks' hospital insurance, the holders of which would get care at no extra cost at the hospital. As the forest was pushed back from the streams, railroads laid spur tracks from the riverbanks into the forest. Much timber was brought to Saginaw by rail, but water transport remained the best and cheapest method. Banking ground was the name given places where logs were dumped on the river shore, even on the ice, to wait for the spring breakup and the flood time of the water. There were two famous banking grounds on the Tittabawassee, and each laid claim to being the world's largest. One of these was at Averill, then known as Red Keg, and the other was at Oxbow between Sanford and Edenville. And as the logs piled up at the banking grounds, they made an awesome sight. The riverbank at Red Keg was 30 to 40 feet high, and before the ice thawed and the logs began to move downstream, the heap of logs in the river would be at ground level. As the logs floated down the Tittabawassee, they were trapped and held at a place known as Bryant's Trip by an immense boom that stretched across the river. Bryant's Trip was in Thomas Township, Saginaw County, about 3 miles upstream, north from present Highway M6, Gratiot Road. It was selected for that point because a bend in the river helped hold back the logs, and when the logs were needed at the sorting places downstream, the trip was opened and logs floated down to be sorted. There was a minor trip at what once was called Brown Bar near Greenpoint, but it was used chiefly to catch stray logs. To sort the logs required agile men, quick with the pick and peavey, a tool with a movable hook on it that would clutch the log, permitting a man to control its movements. All along the Tittabawassee from Bryant Township to the river's mouth, pilings were driven to form pockets into which the logs of various companies were shoved. The logs were identified by the mark on the butt. When enough logs were in a pocket, they were tied into rafts. The log raft was formed by driving hardwood wedges into the logs and then passing ropes from wedge to hold the logs in place. These rafts then were towed or pushed by tugboat down the Saginaw to the mills. And as the lumber industry grew, so did the inventive genius of the lumbermen. Mills switched from the up and down muley saw to the circular saw. Thomas Munn of Bay City introduced a double edging table which trimmed both sides of a board in one operation. Improvement of the saw reduced the amount of waste present in the early cutting operations. The first experiment in the use of a bandsaw for timber cutting was made by James J. McCormick at Bay City about 1858, but it wasn't successful. It was not until about 1883 that this method was perfected and found general acceptance. The chief advantage of the bandsaw was its speed and thin blade, reducing the cost of operation and the amount of sawdust. The demand for Saginaw pine grew, and the appetite of the mills became enormous, and the pine trees had to be cut faster and faster to keep up with them. In 1870, one of the most important inventions in Michigan timber history was achieved. Silas C. Overpack of Manistee came up with what became famous as the Michigan Big Wheels. The big wheels were just that, wheels 10 feet in diameter, high enough to ride over the stumps. Each set of wheels could carry up to 4,000 feet of timber in one load. The advent of the big wheel meant that logging could become a year-round job. The big wheels rumbled through Michigan and on into Wisconsin and Minnesota and then into the great Northwest. The end of the lumbering in Michigan came with a suddenness that was all but tragic. From the peak year of 1882, the annual cut of timber declined steadily until 1897. The lumber bosses saw the end coming and moved on into Wisconsin and Minnesota, and when they had finished there, they moved on to the West Coast. With them went Michigan's colorful lumberjacks. Daylight truly had been let into the Michigan swamps. For a brief period, some mill owners tried to keep going on the Saginaw by rafting logs from Georgian Bay and other Canadian points, but it didn't work out. The pine was too far away. During the 46 years it took to exhaust Michigan's pine, the whine of the sawmill and the cry of timber was heard throughout the state. The Saginaw operation, while credited with being the biggest, was one of many. Muskegon was another large center. So complete was the cutting of the pine that only in rare instances are there any virgin pine left in lower Michigan. One such stand is at Hartwick State Park near Grayling. Here one can still see the great majestic tree that thrilled the lumberjack and made fortunes for many a lumber baron. They had said it would take 100 years to cut Michigan's pine. Man aided by fire did it in less than 50. Chapter 13. Golden Sawdust. Timber was gold in the Saginaw Valley. Thousands of men streamed northward in the fall to work in logging camps, and more were employed in the sawmills from early spring to late fall. Sawmills operated only when the ice was out of the river, simply because the river had to be open for the mills to receive logs. Also, the Great Lakes shipping season closed when winter froze the river and Saginaw Bay. Supplying the lumber camps meant business for food merchants. Loggers had astonishingly big appetites, and it took a tremendous quantity of food to keep a lumberjack going all day in the woods. At the start, lumberjack food was not too good, but soon the camp bosses learned the better the food, the better the men worked. Good camp cooks were able to pick and choose their jobs. Beans were popular in all cookhouses. Most of the navy beans Michigan lumberjacks ate were imported from Vermont. Saginaw Valley hadn't yet turned to agriculture, and the day when it was to become famous for its navy beans was many years distant. Throughout the northern woods, little towns sprang up to supply lumber camps and the lumberjacks with entertainment and relaxation. These towns flourished for a brief while and then faded into memory as the pine vanished. Among these towns were the town of Meredith and Johannesburg, almost forgotten now, but at their prime these were hustling places with stores, churches, schools, and of course the inevitable saloons. Meredith had a dismal end. It withered away, and finally a big tobacco company offered a lot in the city of Meredith for one specified number of its famous brand of plug chewing tobacco. Meredith still exists on the map, a tiny town in Gladwin County. Johannesburg, another of Michigan's ghost lumber towns, was near Gaylord in Otsego County. Its end was more commonplace. The town was sold at public auction around 1930. The lumbering era left descriptive and colorful names to unlikely places. Deadman's Hill near Harrison dates back to the lumber days. The hill was named not because it was so treacherous to travel, but rather for the many dark and evil deeds reportedly done at the Lumberjack's entertainment place on it. Towns such as these developed because there was money to be made in the timber industry and on its fringes. Timberland could be purchased from the government at $1.25 an acre. Men would buy thousands of acres of this cheap land, then make big profits from the timber. Sometimes they made money without cutting the pine. Early in the 1870s, Wellington R. Burt loaned a man some money and, as security, took titles to a section of timberland at the headwaters of Muskegon River near Houghton Lake. The money wasn't repaid, and the land was forfeited to Burt. Several years later, Burt was busy in his office when a rough, hardy fellow walked in. Burt, who had an imperious way about him, paid little attention to him. "You got some timberland on the upper Muskegon?" the man asked. "Yes, and it's for sale," Burt snapped. "What's the price?" Still intent on his work and anxious to be rid of the man, Burt shot back, $100,000. "That's your best price?" "Yes." "We'll take it." Surprised, Burt wheeled in his chair and for the first time really looked at the visitor. "Just who are you anyways?" The stranger represented Hackley and Humes of Muskegon, one of the biggest lumber firms on the western side of the state. There were others who became wealthy because they had sturdy legs. William Callum, who became one of the best-known lumbermen of the Saginaw Valley, was working in the lumber camps and mills in 1857. One day, while hauling logs to the Chippewa River, he found a beautiful stand of pine trees. Some of the trees towered 80 feet to the first branch. The land was government-owned, and the 23-year-old Callum couldn't understand why. But he remembered the location, and when the sawing season ended, he checked at the government land office in Saginaw. The pine was still available. He set out the next day on foot and spent a week in the section surveying the land. It hadn't seen a soul, he said, until about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I saw tracks. The tracks were those of a horse, and Callum knew that they had been made by a landlooker. He realized he had no time to waste if he was going to get those pines, and he set off on foot for Saginaw, 60 miles away. He didn't stop, and staggered into the land office just as it opened the next morning. He picked out 140 acres of the section and bought it at $1.25 an acre. Just as he completed the deal, the landlooker rode up, his horse dripping sweat. Callum had beaten him on foot by about 15 minutes. Callum then bought 6 horses, hired 15 lumberjacks, bought supplies, and loaded the whole outfit on a scow. His wife went along to cook for the crew. They pulled the scow up the Saginaw, Tittabawassee, and the Chippewa until they reached his timber. The next spring, they drove over 1 million feet of pine logs down the same rivers to Saginaw. Logs at the time were worth $10 per 1,000 feet. Callum's endurance had paid a rich dividend. In our next installment, we will begin with Chapter 14, Strike on the River, 10 Hours or No Sawdust. Thanks for stopping by.